The blood-soaked letter trembled in Pearl Vaughn's hands as she read the words that would forever alter her life. Her father was dead, murdered by the notorious Blackwater Gang while defending their homestead outside Tonopah Junction, Nevada. The year was 1875, and at 22 years of age, Pearl found herself completely alone in the world. "Miss Vaughn, you can't possibly be considering going west," Mrs. Abernathy said, her plump face pinched with concern as she watched Pearl pack her meager belongings in the Boston boarding house. "A proper young woman like yourself, heading to that godless frontier, after what those savages did to your family." Pearl's fingers traced the jagged scar that ran from her right temple to her jawline, a permanent reminder of the attack 5 years ago that had claimed her mother's life and left Pearl both physically and emotionally scarred. That night had changed everything. Her father had sent her east for schooling and healing, but now there was nothing left for her here. "I have to go. The ranch is all I have left," Pearl replied, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "The sheriff's letter said my father left everything to me, Mrs." Abernathy clucked her tongue disapprovingly. "Those Western doctors can't help you, dear. The specialists here in Boston couldn't fully restore your leg, and you still walk with that limp. They say you'll never truly heal physically or otherwise." Pearl straightened her back, ignoring the familiar pain shooting through her damaged hip. "I don't need their pity, Mrs. Abernathy. I need my home." 2 weeks later, the stagecoach rattled to a stop in Tonopah Junction, Nevada. Pearl stepped down gingerly, her left leg stiff from the journey. The small mining town sprawled before her, a dusty main street flanked by wooden buildings, so different from Boston's brick-lined streets and sophisticated society. Sheriff Randall Wilson greeted her with a solemn nod. "Miss Vaughn, I'm mighty sorry about your father. Thomas was a good man." "Thank you, Sheriff. I'd like to see the ranch as soon as possible." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "About that, Miss Vaughn, there's been some complications. The Blackwater Gang did considerable damage, and there's the matter of Silas Morgan, who, local cattle baron, been trying to buy your father's land for years. Claims he has a right to it now, something about an old gambling debt. Been letting his men graze on your property since your father passed." Pearl's jaw tightened. "That land belongs to me now." "Yes, madam, legally speaking. But Morgan isn't known for respecting legal niceties. And frankly, even if you could keep him off, that ranch needs considerable work. No offense, but given your—" His eyes flickered to her scarred face and the cane she leaned on. "Condition, I don't see how you could manage it alone." "I'll manage," Pearl replied coldly. "Now, is there anyone willing to take me to my property?" The sheriff sighed. "The O'Malley brothers have a wagon heading that way tomorrow. They can drop you." That evening, Pearl took a room at the town's only hotel. As she unpacked her things, she caught her reflection in the small mirror above the washbasin. The scar looked worse in the dim lamplight, an angry red line that pulled at the corner of her eye and mouth. She turned away quickly, refusing to dwell on what had been taken from her that night when raiders had attacked their homestead, killing her mother and leaving Pearl broken in body and spirit. She was stronger now. She had to be. The next morning, Pearl waited outside the general store for her ride. The O'Malley wagon was nowhere to be seen, but a tall man with a chestnut horse approached instead. His weathered face was partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but she could see piercing blue eyes studying her. "Miss Vaughn?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble. Pearl nodded cautiously. "Owen Ingram," he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat. "Sheriff asked if I'd take you out to your father's place. The O'Malleys got delayed." Pearl hesitated. "And you agreed? Why?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I owed your father a favor. Figure taking his daughter home is a start on repaying that debt. She studied him more carefully. Owen Ingram stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling out a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster worn from use. His face was tanned from the sun, with a neatly trimmed beard that couldn't hide a small scar crossing his chin. He didn't look like the typical cowboys she'd seen loitering around town. There was something more controlled, more purposeful about him. "You're not from around here," she observed. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Not originally, no. Been working ranches in this territory for about 7 years now." "And how did you know my father?" "He helped me when others wouldn't." Owen's tone made it clear that was all the explanation she would get. "We should head out if you want to reach the ranch before sundown." Pearl nodded, gathering her skirts. Owen approached with his hands extended, clearly intending to lift her onto his horse. Pearl stiffened. "I can manage, thank you." Owen raised an eyebrow but stepped back. "As you wish." Pearl immediately regretted her pride as she struggled to mount the horse with her stiff leg. After a humiliating moment, she reluctantly allowed Owen to help her up. "I'll walk alongside," he said, not commenting on her difficulty. They traveled in silence for nearly an hour, leaving the town behind and venturing into the vast Nevada landscape. The terrain was more beautiful than Pearl remembered, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush, backed by distant mountains that seemed to shift colors with the moving sun. "It's another 4 miles, Owen finally said. "You holding up all right?" "I'm fine," Pearl answered automatically, though her hip was throbbing painfully from the unfamiliar motion of riding. Owen glanced up at her, his eyes seeing too much. "No shame in admitting when something hurts, Miss Vaughn." "Is that so, Mr. Ingram? And do you freely admit to your pains?" His lips quirked. "Point taken." As they crested a hill, Pearl suddenly saw it, her father's ranch spread out below them in the valley. Her heart clenched at the sight. The house was still standing, but one side was blackened from fire. The barn's roof had partially collapsed, and the corral fencing was broken in several places. Half a dozen cattle not her father's brand, she noticed, grazed in what had once been their vegetable garden. "Morgan's cattle," Owen confirmed, following her gaze. "He's been moving them in gradually, testing how far he can push." Pearl swallowed hard. Were you here when it happened? When my father was killed?" Owen's face darkened. "No, I was working up north. By the time I heard and made it back, he was already buried." He paused. "For what it's worth, people say he went down fighting, took 3 of them with him." That sounded like her father. Thomas Vaughn had never been one to back down. Pearl blinked back tears, refusing to break down in front of this stranger. As they approached the house, Pearl noticed something that hadn't been visible from a distance, a small tendril of smoke rising from the chimney. "Someone's here," she said sharply. Owen's hand moved to his gun. "Stay behind me." "This is my property," Pearl protested, "and those are likely Morgan's men. Stay behind me if you want to live to claim your property," Owen replied curtly. They approached cautiously. Owen helped Pearl down from the horse, and she insisted on walking beside him rather than behind, using her cane for support. As they neared the porch, the door swung open and 2 men stepped out, both armed, both wearing expressions of surprise that quickly morphed into contempt. "What's this then?" the taller one asked, spitting tobacco juice onto the porch boards. "Ingram bringing us a little lady visitor." "This is Miss Pearl Vaughn," Owen said evenly. "Thomas Vaughn's daughter and the rightful owner of this property. You boys are trespassing." The men exchanged glances. The shorter one, a wiry man with a pockmarked face, laughed harshly. "That's so. Mr. Morgan says different, says this land's his now." "Mr. Morgan is mistaken," Pearl said firmly. I have the deed registered in my name." "Well, ain't you fancy with your Boston accent and big words?" the tall one mocked. "Don't much matter what papers say out here, does it, Hank?" "Nope," his companion agreed with a nasty grin. "What matters is who's got the guns and the men to back their claim." Pearl felt a flush of anger. "My father, your pa's dead, lady," Hank interrupted bluntly. "And Morgan says you got 2 days to clear out anything you want before his boys burn what's left." Owen stepped forward, his stance shifting subtly. "You're talking to a lady, Hank. Show some respect." The tall man snorted. "Lady? With a face like that, looks like someone already tried to carve her up proper." His eyes traveled lewdly down Pearl's body. Though the rest of her might be worth a tumble. Pearl felt her stomach turn, but before she could respond, Owen moved with shocking speed. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the tall man by his shirt and slammed him against the wall of the house. "Apologize," Owen said quietly, the softness of his voice somehow more threatening than a shout. "To hell with you, Ingram," the man spat, reaching for his gun. Owen was faster. He knocked the man's hand away and delivered a swift punch to his gut, doubling him over. Hank went for his own weapon but froze when Owen's gun appeared in his hand, hammer cocked and aimed between Hank's eyes. "I'm not asking again," Owen said. The tall man wheezed, still bent over. "Sorry, miss," he managed. Owen nodded to Hank. "Both of you get your things and get off this property. Tell Morgan if he has a claim, he can take it to the judge in Carson City." "Morgan ain't gonna like this," Hank warned, helping his friend straighten up. "Not my concern," Owen replied. The men retreated inside, emerging minutes later with their saddlebags. They mounted their horses that had been hitched around back, casting dark glances at Owen and Pearl. "This ain't over," the tall one called as they rode away. "Morgan will be back and he'll bring more men next time." Pearl waited until they were out of sight before turning to Owen. "Thank you, but you didn't need to defend me. I've heard worse." Owen holstered his gun. "No one should speak to a lady that way, especially not in her own home." He gestured to the house. "Shall we see what condition they left it in?" The interior of the ranch house was worse than Pearl had feared. While the structure remained sound, the men had treated it like a camp, leaving filth everywhere. Broken furniture was scattered about, her father's possessions either stolen or carelessly tossed aside. Pearl moved slowly through the rooms, each step bringing back memories. Here was where her mother had taught her to sew. There was where her father would sit and read in the evenings. Everything felt smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown up in the years away. In what had been her parents' bedroom, Pearl found her father's trunk had been pried open, its contents strewn across the floor. She knelt painfully and began gathering the item's old letters. A pocket watch, her mother's hairbrush with strands of gray, streaked brown hair still caught in the bristles. She didn't realize she was crying until a tear splashed onto the wooden floor. "Miss Vaughn," Owen's voice came softly from the doorway. Pearl hastily wiped her face. "Yes, I've checked the property. Most of the damage is superficial. The barn needs a new roof section, but the walls are solid. The house just needs cleaning and some minor repairs. Your father's tools are still in the shed out back." He paused. "There's about a month's worth of work for a few good men." "I don't have a few good men," Pearl said, rising awkwardly with the help of her cane. "And I certainly can't afford to hire any." Owen studied her. "What's your plan then?" Pearl lifted her chin. "I'll do the work myself, whatever I can manage, Miss Vaughn." "Pearl," she interrupted. "If you're going to tell me I can't do it, you might as well use my given name." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Pearl," he amended, "you can't do all this yourself." "Not with," he stopped. "Not with my bad leg and weak woman's constitution," she challenged. Owen shook his head. Not with Morgan's men likely to return in force. Even if you could manage all the physical labor, which would be difficult for anyone alone, you'd still have to contend with them. Pearl sighed, the weight of reality settling on her shoulders. What would you suggest then? Sell to Morgan for whatever pittance he offers. No, Owen said firmly. This is your land, your legacy. Then what? Owen was silent for a long moment. I'll help you, he finally said. Pearl blinked in surprise. Why would you do that? I told you I owed your father. What kind of debt requires this level of repayment? Pearl asked suspiciously. Owen's eyes darkened with something Pearl couldn't identify, the kind that can never fully be repaid. Before she could press further, he continued, I can stay and help with repairs. Morgan's men are less likely to cause trouble if I'm here. Are you that intimidating, Mr. Ingram? Owen, he corrected. And it's not about intimidation. Morgan and I have history. He won't move directly against me without considering the consequences. Pearl weighed her options. She didn't know this man, but he had defended her and seemed genuinely interested in helping. And realistically, she couldn't do this alone, no matter how much she wanted to prove otherwise. Very well, Owen, she said finally. I accept your help, but I insist on paying you. That's not necessary. It is to me, Pearl said firmly. I won't be a charity case. I don't have much money, but once we get the ranch running again, I can pay you a fair wage. Owen nodded slowly. All right, but first things first, we need to make this place livable. I'll sleep in the barn tonight and start on repairs tomorrow. Pearl shook her head. Nonsense. The house has 3 bedrooms. You can take the small one at the back. Seeing his hesitation, she added, I assure you, Mr. Ingram, my reputation is already so thoroughly compromised by my scars that having a hired hand sleeping under the same roof will hardly cause additional scandal. The bitterness in her voice must have been apparent because Owen's expression softened slightly. Pearl, he said quietly, scars don't compromise a person's worth. Pearl looked away, uncomfortable with his directness. I'll start cleaning the kitchen, she said, changing the subject. Perhaps we can salvage enough for a meal tonight. The next few days fell into a rhythm of hard work. Pearl cleaned the house from top to bottom while Owen worked on the barn roof and mended the corral fencing. They spoke little beyond what was necessary, each focused on their tasks. In the evenings, Pearl cooked simple meals from the supplies Owen brought from town, and they ate in companionable silence before retiring to their respective rooms. On the 4th day, Pearl was scrubbing the front porch when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She straightened painfully, shading her eyes against the midday sun. 3 riders were approaching, and Pearl recognized the silhouette of the tall man Owen had confronted days earlier. Owen, she called urgently. He appeared from the barn instantly, wiping his hands on a rag. Seeing the approaching riders, he moved to stand beside Pearl on the porch, his hand resting casually near his holster. The riders stopped a respectful distance from the house. The man in the center was clearly their leader, older than the others, with silver threading through his dark hair and a well-trimmed mustache. He was expensively dressed, with a black waistcoat and a silver watch chain gleaming in the sun. Silas Morgan, Owen said flatly. Ingram, the man acknowledged with a slight nod before turning his attention to Pearl. And this must be Thomas's daughter, Miss Vaughn, I presume. Pearl nodded coolly. Mr. Morgan. Morgan removed his hat, revealing more silver-streaked hair. My deepest condolences on your father's passing, Miss Vaughn. Thomas and I had our differences, but I never wished him harm. Just wished him off his land, Owen remarked. Morgan's eyes flashed with irritation before his smooth demeanor returned. Business is business, Ingram. Something you never quite grasped. He turned back to Pearl. Miss Vaughn, I understand you intend to keep this ranch. A noble sentiment, but perhaps impractical. I'd like to make you a fair offer." "I'm not selling, Mr. Morgan," Pearl replied firmly. "Miss Vaughn, please consider your situation. This is difficult country for a woman alone, especially one with physical challenges." His eyes flickered briefly to her cane. "I'm prepared to offer $3,000 for the property." "That's a generous sum that would allow you to return east and live comfortably." Pearl felt anger rising in her chest. "This land has been in my family for 15 years, Mr. Morgan. My parents are buried here. It's not for sale, not to you, not to anyone." Morgan sighed. "I admire your spirit, but I fear you're being unrealistic. The ranch needs extensive work, and you'll need hands to run cattle. Hands that I could easily persuade not to work for you." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Morgan?" Pearl asked. "Merely stating facts, my dear. I control most of the water rights in this valley. The men who don't work directly for me still depend on my goodwill." Owen stepped forward. "She's not alone, Morgan, and your intimidation tactics won't work here." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Ingram, you surprise me. Playing protector to Thomas Vaughn's daughter. How? Unexpected given your history." Pearl glanced questioningly at Owen, whose face had hardened into an unreadable mask. "My offer stands for 1 week, Miss Vaughn," Morgan continued. "After that, I cannot guarantee it will remain as generous. This territory can be dangerous for those without friends." He settled his hat back on his head. "Good day to you both." As the 3 riders departed, Pearl turned to Owen. "What did he mean about your history?" Owen's jaw tightened. "It's not important." "It seems important to me," Pearl insisted. "If I'm trusting you with my home and safety, I deserve to know who I'm trusting." Owen was silent for so long that Pearl thought he might refuse to answer. Finally, he sighed. "I used to work for Morgan, years ago when I first came to the territory. And we had a fundamental disagreement about how men should be treated. I left his employ rather abruptly." Pearl sensed there was much more to the story, but Owen's tone made it clear he wouldn't elaborate further. "Why would that make it unexpected that you're helping me?" Owen met her eyes. "Because your father is the one who helped me leave Morgan's employ. He gave me work when no one else would and kept Morgan's men from coming after me until things cooled down." Understanding dawned on Pearl. "That's the debt you mentioned." Owen nodded once. "Yes." "There's more you're not telling me," Pearl observed. "Yes," Owen admitted. "But it's not relevant to our current situation. What matters is that Morgan won't back down easily. He wants this land because it controls access to the north, past a shorter route to the railhead at Reno." Pearl considered this. "So even his generous offer is less than the land is actually worth to him." Owen looked faintly surprised. "Yes." "Then we definitely won't sell," Pearl said decisively. "But we do need to consider our next steps. Morgan was right about one thing: we'll need hands if we're going to run cattle again. I might know some men who'd be willing to work for you, despite Morgan," Owen said thoughtfully. "Men who have their own reasons for not caring about Morgan's goodwill." "Outlaws?" Pearl asked dubiously. Owen's lips quirked. "Former outlaws, maybe, men looking for a fresh start. Like your father gave me." Pearl studied him with new interest. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Ingram." "So are you, Miss Vaughn," he replied. "Most women would have taken Morgan's money and fled at the first sign of trouble." "I'm not most women," Pearl said simply. "No," Owen agreed, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "You certainly are not." That evening, as they ate a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Pearl broke their usual silence. "Tell me about yourself, Owen. Where were you before Nevada?" Owen took a sip of coffee before answering. "Texas, originally. Fought for the Confederacy, though I was young and stupid and didn't rightly understand what I was fighting for." He shook his head. "After the war, there wasn't much left for me there. drifted west, worked cattle drives, tried my hand at prospecting. And family? None left, he said shortly. Lost my parents before the war, no siblings. Pearl nodded, recognizing the wall he'd put up. I'm sorry. Owen changed the subject. What about you? Your father sent you east after the attack. Pearl's hand instinctively rose to her scarred cheek. Yes. To Boston, to stay with my mother's cousin. There were doctors there who said they might be able to help. With your leg, Pearl nodded, and my face. They did what they could. She laughed humorlessly. Though, as Mrs. Abernathy was fond of reminding me, they all said I'd never fully heal. That some wounds go too deep. Owen's eyes held hers. Mrs. Abernathy sounds like a fool. Pearl blinked in surprise. She meant well. People who mean well often do the most damage, Owen observed. Telling someone they'll never heal becomes a prophecy that fulfills itself. Pearl had never thought of it that way. Perhaps, but the doctors weren't wrong about my leg. It will never be what it was. Few of us remain unbroken by life, Pearl, Owen said quietly. The question is whether we let those breaks define us. The simple wisdom of his words struck Pearl deeply. She had spent 5 years defining herself by what had been taken from her that night: her beauty, her easy grace, her confidence. Perhaps it was time to define herself by what remained and what could still be built. Thank you, she said softly. Owen looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. For what? For seeing me as more than my scars. His eyes softened. Anyone who doesn't is blind to what matters. The moment stretched between them, filled with something Pearl couldn't quite name. Finally, Owen cleared his throat and stood. I should turn in. Dawn comes early. As Pearl lay in bed that night, she found herself thinking about Owen Ingram, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness. There was a story there, behind those piercing blue eyes. A story of pain, perhaps not unlike her own. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of curiosity about another person that went beyond polite interest. The next morning, Pearl woke to the sound of voices outside. She dressed quickly and made her way to the front porch, where she found Owen speaking with 3 rough-looking men on horseback. Pearl, Owen said, turning as she appeared. These are the men I mentioned: Jack Fletcher, Samuel Wright, and Caleb Donovan. Each man touched the brim of his hat in greeting, eyeing Pearl with curiosity, but none of the disdain she'd grown accustomed to seeing. Miss Vaughn, the oldest of the 3, said. He was perhaps in his early 40s, with a weathered face and graying beard. Jack Fletcher. Owen here says you're looking for hands to work your ranch. Yes, Mr. Fletcher, Pearl replied. Though I should be honest, I can't offer much in wages until we get the place profitable again. Fletcher exchanged glances with his companions. Way we hear it, Silas Morgan set against you succeeding. That true? Pearl nodded. He wants this land. He's made that quite clear. A slow smile spread across Fletcher's face. Well then, anything that puts a burr under Morgan's saddle is worth doing in my book. We've all had our run-ins with that snake. The youngest of the 3, a lean man with sandy hair who couldn't be much older than Pearl herself, spoke up. We're not looking for charity, madam, just fair treatment and honest work. And that's what you'll get, Mr. Donovan, Pearl assured him. Along with a share of profits once we're producing again. The 3 men nodded, seemingly satisfied. Owen outlined his plan. They would focus on repairing the infrastructure first, then round up any of Thomas Vaughn's cattle that might still be roaming the range. After that, they could consider purchasing new stock. As the men headed toward the barn to stow their gear, Pearl turned to Owen. Former outlaws, you said. Owen shrugged. Fletcher served time for robbery, but that was years ago. Donovan had some trouble with a gambling house in Carson City that wasn't exactly his fault. Right's the closest thing to an actual outlaw road with a gang that rustled Morgan's cattle 3 years back. Pearl raised her eyebrows. And you trust these men? With my life, Owen said simply. They're rough around the edges, but they have their own code. They won't betray you. Pearl had to trust his judgment. Very well, but where will they sleep? The barn isn't fully repaired yet. There's the old bunkhouse out back, Owen reminded her. It needs work, but the structure is sound. They can make do for now. Over the next 2 weeks, the ranch began to transform. The men worked from sunrise to sunset, repairing fences, rebuilding the barn roof, and clearing fields. Pearl focused on the house and garden, planting vegetables that would supplement their meals in the coming months. Each evening, the men would gather for supper, which Pearl insisted on cooking despite their protests that they could fend for themselves. These meals became a time of camaraderie, with the men sharing stories and gradually including Pearl in their rough humor. She learned that Jack Fletcher had a wife and 2 grown children in Sacramento, whom he visited twice a year. Caleb Donovan was saving to buy his own small spread someday. Samuel Wright, the quietest of the 3, had been a schoolteacher before the war changed everything. Owen remained somewhat apart, joining in the conversations but rarely volunteering information about himself. Yet Pearl noticed how the other men deferred to him, not out of fear but respect. Whatever his past, Owen Ingram was a man who inspired loyalty. Pearl also noticed how Owen watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, with an expression that made her heart beat faster. Sometimes their hands would brush as they worked side by side, and the brief contact would send warmth spreading through her body. It had been so long since she'd felt attractive, desirable. Not since the attack that had left her scarred and limping had a man looked at her the way Owen sometimes did. But each time she caught his gaze, he would quickly look away, as if ashamed of his interest. This puzzled Pearl until one evening, as she was hanging laundry, she overheard a conversation between Owen and Fletcher near the corral. "You're playing with fire, Ingram," Fletcher's gruff voice carried on the still air. "I don't know what you mean," Owen replied, his tone neutral. Fletcher snorted. "The way you look at her, the girl's been through enough without you complicating matters." "I'm not, you are," Fletcher interrupted. "And given your history with her father, it ain't right." Pearl froze, straining to hear Owen's response. "That's between me and Thomas Vaughn," Owen said coldly, "and he's gone now." "Don't mean the debt is paid," Fletcher countered. "Besides, what happens when she learns the truth? You think she'll still look at you the same way?" "She won't learn it from me," Owen said. "And if you're my friend, she won't learn it from you either." The conversation shifted to work matters, leaving Pearl puzzled and troubled. What truth was Owen hiding? What history with her father could be so damning? That night, Pearl couldn't sleep, her mind churning with questions. She finally gave up, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and stepping outside into the cool night air. The moon was nearly full, bathing the ranch in silvery light. She made her way carefully to the garden bench her father had built years ago, which the men had recently repaired. She sat listening to the night sounds, crickets chirping, an owl hooting in the distance, the occasional soft nickering of horses in the corral. This land had always brought her peace, even after the attack. Whatever had happened here, it was still home. "Can't sleep." Owen's voice came softly from behind her. Pearl wasn't startled, somehow she'd sensed his presence. "Too many thoughts," she admitted as he sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Worry can wait for daylight," Owen advised. "That's what my mother used to say." "Wise woman," Pearl murmured. She was. They sat in silence for a while, the moonlight casting Owen's profile in sharp relief. Pearl studied him surreptitiously, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar on his chin, The way his hands, resting on his knees, were both powerful and gentle. Hands that could build as easily as they could destroy. "Owen," she finally said, "what aren't you telling me?" He stiffened slightly. "What do you mean?" "I overheard you and Fletcher talking. About your history with my father, about a debt that isn't paid." Owen was silent for so long that Pearl thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed heavily. "It's not a simple story, Pearl, and not one I'm proud of. Tell me anyway," she urged softly. "I need to know." Owen gazed out at the moonlit landscape. "I told you I worked for Morgan when I first came here. What I didn't tell you is what I did for him." His voice hardened. "I was his enforcer. When people wouldn't sell their land, I persuaded them." Pearl felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "You hurt people." "Yes." The simple admission hung between them. "I was good at it. Too good. I told myself I was just doing a job, that I never killed anyone, but I hurt people, scared them, drove them off land their families had worked for generations. And my father—" Owen's hands clenched into fists on his knees. "Your father was different. When Morgan sent me to talk to him, Thomas wasn't intimidated. He offered me coffee, sat me down, and asked why a man with my obvious intelligence was wasting his life doing Morgan's dirty work." Owen smiled faintly at the memory. "No one had ever spoken to me that way, like I was worth more than my ability to threaten and harm." Pearl could imagine her father doing exactly that. Thomas Vaughn had always seen the best in people, sometimes to his detriment. "What happened?" she asked. "I couldn't do it," Owen admitted. "Couldn't threaten him. I went back and told Morgan your father wasn't selling. Morgan was furious, said if I wouldn't do the job, he'd send someone who would." Owen's voice grew tight. "That night, I warned your father. He offered me work on the spot, said any man willing to stand up to Silas Morgan was welcome at his table." Pearl's mind was racing, piecing together the timeline. "This was before the attack, before my mother died." Owen nodded, his expression haunted. 6 months before. "I worked for your father, lived in that bunkhouse. Your mother was kind to me, though I didn't deserve it." He paused. "When the raid came, I wasn't here. Your father had sent me to Carson City for supplies." "The raid," Pearl said slowly. "Morgan arranged it. He hired men from outside the territory, made it look like a random attack by outlaws. By the time I returned—" Owen's voice broke. "Your mother was dead, you were badly injured, your father was half mad with grief." Pearl touched her scarred cheek reflexively. "And he blamed you." "Not directly, but I blamed myself. I should have known what Morgan would do, should have been here to stop it." The pieces fell into place. "So that's the debt. You think you owe my father for what happened to us?" Owen finally looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. "Don't you see, Pearl? The attack, your scars, your injured leg, all of it happened because I failed to protect your family after I brought Morgan's attention to your father." Pearl absorbed this revelation, turning it over in her mind. She should be angry, she knew. Perhaps even hate this man sitting beside her. Yet all she felt was a profound sadness for the weight he'd carried all these years. "Did you know what Morgan would do?" she asked quietly. "No," Owen answered without hesitation. "I knew he was ruthless, but I never imagined he'd attack a family, kill a woman, hurt a child." "Then how is it your fault?" Pearl asked simply. Owen stared at her. "How can you ask that, if not for me? If not for you, Morgan would have sent someone else to threaten my father. Someone who wouldn't have warned him, who might have hurt him directly." Pearl shook her head. "Morgan is responsible for what happened, not you." "Your father didn't see it that way," Owen said bitterly. "After you were sent east, he could barely look at me. He kept me on because he was a man of his word, but things were never the same between us." "My father was a good man," Pearl said softly, "but he wasn't perfect. Grief changes people, Owen, makes them see the world differently." She took a deep breath. "Is that why you help me now, out of guilt?" Owen was silent for a moment. It started that way, he admitted. But now. His voice trailed off. Now, Pearl prompted. Owen looked at her directly, his blue eyes intense in the moonlight. Now I help you because you're the strongest, most determined woman I've ever met. Because despite everything that's happened to you, you refuse to be broken by it. The raw honesty in his voice made Pearl's breath catch. I am broken, Owen. My body, at least. No, he said firmly. Injured, yes. Changed, certainly. But not broken. He hesitated, then gently touched her hand where it rested on the bench between them. The body heals as much as it can. It's the spirit that must choose to mend or remain wounded. His words resonated deep within her. For years, she had defined herself by what had been taken, seeing herself as irreparably damaged. But sitting here under the vast Nevada sky, Pearl suddenly saw herself through Owen's eyes as someone strong, resilient, worthy. Impulsively, she turned her hand beneath his, twining their fingers together. Thank you, she whispered. Owen looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. The moonlight softened her scar, but he wasn't looking at the mark anyway. He was looking into her eyes, seeing her. Pearl, he said softly, I'm not a good man. I've done things I can never make right. We've all made choices we regret, she replied. What matters is the choices we make now. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Owen reached up and touched her scarred cheek with his free hand. His touch was impossibly gentle, tracing the line that ran from temple to jaw. Pearl held perfectly still, afraid to breathe, afraid to break whatever spell had fallen over them. Beautiful, he murmured, and she knew he meant it. Owen leaned forward, hesitating just a breath away from her lips. Pearl closed the distance between them, pressing her mouth to his in a kiss that started tentatively but quickly deepened with suppressed longing. His arms came around her, drawing her closer, and Pearl felt something long dormant flare to life within her desire, yes, but more than that. Hope. When they finally parted, both breathless, Owen rested his forehead against hers. I don't deserve this, he whispered. Pearl smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. It's not about deserving, Owen. It's about choosing. And I choose to leave the past where it belongs. For the first time since she'd met him, Owen smiled, fully a genuine expression that transformed his face and made Pearl's heart skip. You're remarkable, Pearl Vaughn, as are you, Owen Ingram. She shivered slightly in the cool night air, and Owen immediately stood, offering his hand. You should get some rest, he said. Tomorrow will be another long day. Pearl allowed him to help her up, appreciating that he didn't fuss over her as she found her balance with her cane. They walked back to the house in comfortable silence, their hands still joined. At the door to her bedroom, Owen lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Good night, Pearl. Good night, Owen, she replied, reluctantly releasing his hand and entering her room. As she lay in bed, Pearl touched her lips, still feeling the pressure of Owen's kiss. For the first time in years, she didn't think about her scars or her damaged leg. Instead, she thought about possibilities, a future that might hold more than just survival. The next morning, Pearl awoke to the sound of raised voices. She dressed quickly and hurried outside to find Owen and the men gathered near the corral, staring at something in the distance. Following their gaze, she saw a plume of dust rising from the road, several riders approaching fast. Morgan's men, she asked, joining them. Owen nodded grimly. Looks like more than just his regular hands. He's bringing serious pressure this time. Fletcher spat on the ground. Well, he'll find more waiting for him than he expects. The four men moved instinctively to form a line in front of Pearl, but she stepped forward to stand beside Owen. This is my ranch, she said firmly. I'll face them with you. Owen glanced at her, his expression a mixture of concern and pride. "Stay behind me if shooting starts," he said quietly. As the riders drew closer, Pearl counted 8 men, far more than they could reasonably hope to fight off if it came to violence. Leading them was Silas Morgan himself, looking immaculate despite the dusty ride. The group pulled up about 20 yards from the house. Morgan's eyes narrowed when he saw Fletcher and the others. "Ingram, you're keeping interesting company these days," he called. "Thieves and rustlers." "Still better company than you, Morgan," Owen replied evenly. Morgan's gaze shifted to Pearl. "Miss Vaughn, I see you've rejected my generous offer by aligning yourself with these individuals. I'm disappointed." "Your disappointment means nothing to me, Mr. Morgan," Pearl replied coolly. "This is my land. I've made my position clear." Morgan's pleasant facade dropped. "Perhaps I wasn't clear enough about the consequences of defying me. This territory belongs to those strong enough to hold it. A crippled woman and 4 misfits aren't strong enough." Pearl flinched at the cruel description, but Owen stepped forward, his voice dangerously soft. "Careful, Morgan, you're speaking to a lady," Morgan laughed. "A lady? With hired guns and outlaws for protection? I think not." His expression hardened. "I'm done playing games, Miss Vaughn. You have until sundown tomorrow to clear out. After that, I can't guarantee your safety or that of your protectors." "That sounds remarkably like a threat, Morgan," Fletcher said, his hand hovering near his gun. "Not a threat, Fletcher. A promise." Morgan's eyes were cold. "Miss Vaughn, be reasonable. Take the money I've offered and leave while you can still do so with dignity." Pearl straightened her back, ignoring the familiar pain in her hip. "Mr. Morgan, my father defended this land with his life. I intend to honor his memory by doing the same if necessary." "Your threats don't frighten me," Morgan's face flushed with anger. "You'll regret this decision, girl, I promise you that." He wheeled his horse around. "Sundown tomorrow," he repeated before riding away, his men following close behind. As the dust from their departure settled, Pearl felt her confidence waver. Had she just signed their death warrants with her defiance? "He means it," Wright said quietly, voicing what they all knew. "Morgan doesn't make empty threats." Owen nodded. "We need to prepare. Fletcher, you and Wright ride to town. See if there's anyone else willing to stand with us. Donovan, check our ammunition supplies and start fortifying the house and barn." As the men dispersed to their tasks, Owen turned to Pearl. "You should reconsider, Pearl. Take Morgan's money and go somewhere safe. This could get ugly." Pearl shook her head firmly. "This is my home, Owen. I won't be driven from it by threats and intimidation. Not again." Her voice softened. "But you and the others don't need to risk your lives for my stubborn pride. I would understand if you chose to leave." Owen's expression was incredulous. "Leave? Pearl, I'm here because I want to be, because I believe in what we're fighting for." He took her hand, his touch gentle despite the calluses roughening his skin. "Besides, I think we both know it's too late for me to walk away from you now." The simple honesty of his words warmed her. "Then we stand together," she said. "Together," he agreed, squeezing her hand before releasing it. "But first, we need a plan that doesn't end with all of us dead." Throughout the day, they prepared as best they could. Donovan inventoried their weapons and ammunition, reporting they had enough for a decent fight, but not a prolonged siege. Owen and Pearl worked on fortifying the house, moving furniture to create barricades near windows and doors. By evening, Fletcher and Wright had returned with disappointing news. None of the townsfolk were willing to openly oppose Morgan, though the sheriff had promised to look into the situation if actual violence occurred. "Too little, too late," Fletcher commented grimly. They gathered around the kitchen table after supper, discussing strategy. Morgan had 8 men that they'd seen, possibly more in reserve. Their own small force consisted of 4 men, skilled fighters to be sure, but outnumbered. What about the law? Pearl asked. Surely threatening violence is illegal, even in the territories. Wright snorted. Sheriff Wilson's afraid of Morgan. He won't intervene unless the shooting's already done. And the judge in Carson City is in Morgan's pocket, Donovan added. Even if we could get word to him in time. Pearl drummed her fingers on the table, thinking. What if we could prove Morgan was behind the attack that killed my mother, the one that injured me? The men exchanged glances. That was 5 years ago, Fletcher said gently. Evidence would be hard to come by. Not necessarily, Owen said slowly. The men Morgan hired weren't from around here, but one of them, Riker, is rumored to be working a claim near Virginia City now. If we could find him, persuade him to talk. That's a big if, Wright pointed out. And Virginia City is 2 days' ride from here. Morgan's given us until tomorrow sundown. So we need to buy time, Pearl said, her mind racing. What if I appeared to accept Morgan's offer? Asked for a few days to arrange my affairs before leaving? Owen shook his head. He's not a fool, Pearl. He'd suspect a ploy. Not if I make it convincing, she insisted. I'm a woman alone, frightened by his show of force. It would be believable that I'd reconsider. The men debated the merits of the plan. Eventually, they agreed it was worth trying. Pearl would ride to Morgan's ranch the next morning, appearing to surrender while asking for additional time. Meanwhile, Owen and Fletcher would make for Virginia City to find Riker, while Wright and Donovan remained to protect the ranch. As the others retired for the night, Owen lingered in the kitchen with Pearl. I don't like the idea of you facing Morgan alone, he admitted. I'll be fine, Pearl assured him, though her own stomach churned with anxiety. Morgan's many things, but I don't think he'd harm a woman in his own home. It would damage his standing in the community. Owen's eyes were troubled. Just be careful. If anything feels wrong, leave immediately. Promise me. Pearl nodded. I promise. She hesitated, then added, you be careful too. Finding Riker won't be easy, and if he was involved in the attack. I can handle Riker, Owen said confidently. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind Pearl's ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. We'll get through this, Pearl, together. Pearl leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his steady presence. Together, she echoed softly. The morning dawned clear and bright, belying the tension gripping the ranch. Pearl dressed carefully in her best riding skirt and jacket, arranging her hair neatly beneath her hat. If she was to play the part of a defeated woman accepting reality, she needed to look the part. Owen helped her mount the gentle mare they'd purchased in town the previous week. His hands lingered at her waist longer than necessary, his blue eyes intense as he looked up at her. Remember your promise, he said quietly. Pearl nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I'll see you in 4 days, she replied, refusing to consider any other possibility. Owen stepped back as she turned the mare toward the road. 4 days, he confirmed. Morgan's ranch lay 8 miles to the south, a sprawling property that dwarfed the Vaughn homestead. As Pearl approached, she couldn't help but admire the imposing 2-story house with its wide veranda and carefully tended gardens. This was what wealth and power looked like in the territory, and what Morgan thought he could use to intimidate her into submission. A ranch hand spotted her and alerted the house. By the time Pearl reached the front yard, Silas Morgan himself stood waiting on the porch, his expression a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. Miss Vaughn, he called as a hand helped her dismount. This is an unexpected pleasure. Please, join me inside where it's cooler. Pearl allowed herself to be escorted into the house, leaning more heavily on her cane than usual to emphasize her vulnerability. The interior was as impressive as the exterior, expensive furnishings, carpets from back east, oil paintings on the walls. Everything designed to display Morgan's wealth and influence. In the sitting room, A Hispanic woman silently served tea before withdrawing at Morgan's dismissive gesture. Pearl noted the woman's downcast eyes and submissive posture with distaste. "I must admit, I didn't expect to see you until my deadline expired," Morgan said, settling into an armchair across from Pearl. "Have you reconsidered my offer?" Pearl looked down at her teacup, feigning resignation. "Mr. Morgan, I'm not a fool. I understand the realities of my situation. A woman alone can't hope to successfully run a ranch in this territory, especially against opposition." Morgan's smile was triumphant. "I'm pleased to see you've come to your senses, Miss Vaughn. The offer of $3,000 still stands." "And I'm prepared to accept it," Pearl said, looking up to meet his gaze. "But I need time. There are personal items to pack, arrangements to make for transport back east, my father's grave to visit one last time." She allowed her voice to break slightly on the last words. Morgan studied her, clearly searching for deception. "How much time do you require?" "A week," Pearl replied. "Surely that's not unreasonable for dismantling a lifetime." Morgan tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair, considering. "3 days," he finally said, "and Ingram and his associates must leave immediately. I don't want them on that property any longer than necessary." Pearl hesitated, as if the demand troubled her. "They've been kind to me, Mr. Morgan. I had hoped they might help with the packing and preparations." "Kind?" Morgan laughed harshly. "My dear Miss Vaughn, those men aren't capable of kindness. They're using you to get at me, particularly Ingram." "What do you mean?" Pearl asked, genuinely curious about Morgan's perspective. Morgan leaned forward. "Has Ingram told you about his past, the things he's done?" "The real reason he turned against me." When Pearl remained silent, he smiled coldly. "I thought not. Owen Ingram is a killer, Miss Vaughn. He has blood on his hands that will never wash clean." "We all have regrets," Pearl said carefully. "Things we wish we'd done differently. Regrets." Morgan laughed again. "Ingram doesn't regret the men he's killed. He only regrets being caught at it." He sipped his tea before continuing. "Did he tell you why he left my employ?" "The real reason," Pearl's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. "He said you had a disagreement about business practices." "Is that what he calls it?" Morgan shook his head. "Ingram killed one of my men in cold blood. A dispute over a woman in a saloon that escalated beyond all reason. He would have hung if your father hadn't intervened, testified it was self-defense when we both know it wasn't." Pearl's mind raced. Could this be true? Had Owen lied to her about his past? Or was Morgan manipulating her, trying to drive a wedge between her and her strongest ally? "That has nothing to do with our current business," Pearl said, setting down her teacup with a steady hand despite her inner turmoil. "Do we have an agreement, Mr. Morgan? 3 days to prepare, and then I'll sign over the deed to the property." Morgan studied her face, apparently satisfied with what he saw. "Very well. 3 days, starting tomorrow. I'll have my lawyer prepare the documents." He rose, indicating their meeting was concluded. "You've made a wise decision, Miss Vaughn. With that money, you can build a comfortable life elsewhere, perhaps even find a husband who won't mind your condition." Pearl forced herself to smile as if grateful for his concern, though rage burned in her chest at his casual cruelty. "You're very kind, Mr. Morgan." As a ranch hand helped her remount her mare, Morgan stood watching from the porch. "Remember our agreement, Miss Vaughn," he called. 3 days, and Ingram leaves today." Pearl nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and turned her horse toward home. Once out of sight of the ranch house, she urged the mare into a gallop, heedless of the jolting pain in her hip. She needed distance between herself and Silas Morgan, needed time to think about what she'd learned and what might be lies. When she returned to the ranch, she found only Wright and Donovan waiting. Owen and Fletcher had already departed for Virginia City, leaving at dawn to make the most of their limited time. "Did Morgan believe you?" Wright asked as he helped her from the saddle. "I think so," Pearl said, massaging her aching leg. "He's given us 3 days, which should be enough time for Owen and Fletcher to return with Riker if they can find him." Inside the house, Pearl sat heavily at the kitchen table, her thoughts in turmoil. "Morgan said things about Owen," she admitted to Wright. "Things I'm not sure whether to believe." Wright poured her a cup of coffee and sat across from her. "Morgan's a snake," he said bluntly. "He'll say anything to get what he wants." "That's what I thought," Pearl agreed. "But what if? What if there's truth in what he said? What if Owen has done things worse than he's admitted?" Wright was silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Miss Vaughn, most men out here have done things they ain't proud of. The West doesn't breed saints." He sipped his coffee. "But I've known Owen Ingram for going on 4 years now. He's a man who lives by a code. Maybe not the same code as a preacher or a judge, but a code nonetheless." "A code that allows for killing," Pearl asked quietly, "when necessary," Wright acknowledged, "but never for pleasure or gain. Only to protect what matters." He met her gaze directly. "And right now, what matters to him is you." Pearl absorbed this, finding comfort in Wright's certainty even as doubts lingered in her mind. "Thank you, Mr. Wright." "Samuel," he corrected with a small smile. "After all this, I think we've earned first names." The next 2 days passed in tense anticipation. Pearl, Wright, and Donovan continued working on the ranch, maintaining the pretense that Pearl was preparing to leave while actually reinforcing their defenses. Pearl packed a few trunks with personal items, visible evidence of her supposed preparations, should any of Morgan's men ride by to check. On the morning of the 3rd day, the deadline Morgan had set, there was still no sign of Owen and Fletcher. Pearl tried to quell her growing anxiety, reminding herself that the ride to Virginia City and back would take at least 4 days under the best circumstances. "They'll be cutting it close," Donovan observed as they ate a hasty breakfast. "If they make it back at all." "They'll make it," Pearl said with more confidence than she felt. Owen wouldn't. She was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, many of them. Wright moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "Morgan's men," he reported grimly. "At least a dozen, and Morgan himself leading them." Pearl's heart sank. "He's a day early." "He never intended to honor the agreement," Wright said, checking his revolver. "Donovan, get the rifles from the back room." "Wait," Pearl said, rising from the table. "Let me talk to him first. Maybe I can still buy us more time." Wright looked skeptical but nodded. "We'll be ready if talking fails." Pearl smoothed her skirt and made her way to the front porch, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the wooden boards. She watched as Morgan and his men approached, their expressions grim and purposeful. "This was no friendly visit to collect a deed, Mr. Morgan," Pearl called as they drew near. "You're early. Our agreement was for 3 days." Morgan reined in his horse, signaling his men to do the same. "I've decided to expedite matters, Miss Vaughn. My patience is at an end." "I'm not ready to leave," Pearl said firmly. "I need the full time we agreed upon." Morgan's eyes narrowed. "Where is Ingram? I told you he was to leave immediately." "He's gone," Pearl answered truthfully. "He and Fletcher left 2 days ago." "And yet Wright and Donovan remain," Morgan observed, nodding toward the house where the 2 men could be seen through the windows, rifles at the ready. "It seems you haven't taken our agreement seriously, Miss Vaughn." "I need help packing and preparing," Pearl insisted. "They've been assisting me." Morgan's laugh was cold. "You take me for a fool. Did you really think I wouldn't have men watching this property? Didn't notice Fletcher and Ingram riding north instead of east toward Carson City?" He shook his head. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Vaughn." "When you cannot win," Pearl's mind raced. Morgan knew Owen and Fletcher had gone to Virginia City. If he'd had men watching them, he might already know their purpose. "What do you want, Morgan?" she asked, dropping the pretense. "What I've always wanted, this land." His expression hardened. "And now I'll have it one way or another." "You'll have to kill me first," Pearl said boldly, though fear coursed through her veins. Morgan's smile chilled her blood. "If necessary, though I'd prefer to avoid such unpleasantness." He gestured, and his men spread out, surrounding the house at a distance. "Your defenders are outnumbered, Miss Vaughn. Surrender the property now, and I'll still honor the financial arrangement. Fight, and you'll lose everything, including your life." Pearl glanced back at the house, where Wright and Donovan stood ready but clearly outmatched. Where was Owen? Had he and Fletcher been intercepted on their way back? Were they even now lying dead on some lonely trail? "I need time to consider," she said, playing for any delay she could get. Morgan shook his head. "No more time, Miss Vaughn. Decide now." Before Pearl could respond, the sound of galloping horses came from the north. All heads turned to see two riders approaching at breakneck speed, Owen and Fletcher, returning at last. Hope surged in Pearl's chest, only to be crushed as she realized they were alone. No Riker, no evidence against Morgan. Morgan cursed under his breath. "It seems your reinforcements have arrived, Miss Vaughn, though it changes nothing." He raised his voice to address his men. "Take them alive if possible. Ingram is mine." Chaos erupted as Owen and Fletcher reached the edge of the property. Morgan's men opened fire, forcing the pair to dive from their horses and take cover behind a water trough. Wright and Donovan returned fire from the house, while Pearl scrambled back to the porch, narrowly avoiding bullets that splintered the wood around her. "Pearl," Owen shouted. "Get inside." She half ran, half limped to the door, her cane forgotten in her haste. Inside, she grabbed a rifle that Donovan had left leaning against the wall and moved to a window, determined to fight alongside the others. The gunfight intensified, with Morgan's men gradually closing in on the house. Owen and Fletcher were pinned down, unable to reach the relative safety of the building. Pearl fired carefully, aiming not to kill but to force Morgan's men to keep their distance. "We can't hold them off forever," Wright said grimly, reloading his rifle. "We're running low on ammunition." "We just need to hold until help arrives," Pearl replied, firing again. Wright gave her a confused look. "What help?" Before she could answer, the sound of galloping hooves came again, this time from the east. Pearl smiled grimly. "That help." They all turned to see a cloud of dust approaching rapidly. As it drew nearer, they could make out at least 20 riders, and at their head the unmistakable figure of Sheriff Wilson. Morgan's men faltered, uncertain in the face of this new development. Morgan himself looked stunned, then furious. "Wilson," he shouted, "what is the meaning of this?" The sheriff rode forward, flanked by his deputies and what appeared to be a posse of townsfolk. "Silas Morgan, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and assault." "This is absurd," Morgan sputtered. "What evidence could you possibly have?" In answer, a figure rode forward from among the posse, a weathered man with a scar across one cheek whom Pearl didn't recognize. "Riker." "We found your man, Morgan," Owen called, rising cautiously from behind the water trough. And he was remarkably eager to talk once he understood his options. Fletcher emerged as well, his rifle trained on Morgan. Amazing what the fear of hanging will do to a man's loyalty. Morgan's face contorted with rage. He drew his pistol with surprising speed, aiming not at Owen or the sheriff, but at Pearl where she stood in the window. "If I go down, she goes with me," he snarled. Several shots rang out simultaneously. Morgan jerked and fell from his horse, blood blooming on his chest. Pearl ducked instinctively, though the bullets had flown in the opposite direction. When she looked up again, Owen was running toward the house, his expression frantic. "Pearl," he shouted. "Are you hit?" "I'm fine," she called back, moving to the door and flinging it open. Owen reached her in seconds, gathering her into his arms with such force that he lifted her off her feet. "Thank God," he murmured against her hair. "When I saw him aim at you." Pearl clung to him, her heart pounding with the aftermath of fear and the relief of his safe return. "You came back," she whispered. "I was afraid Morgan had intercepted you." "He tried," Owen replied, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Sent men to cut us off, but we took a different route back through the high country." Outside, the sheriff and his men were disarming Morgan's hands, who surrendered without their leader. Morgan himself lay still on the ground, attended by a deputy who confirmed what they already knew: he was dead, shot by multiple defenders. "What happened in Virginia City?" Pearl asked. "How did you convince Riker to testify?" Owen smiled grimly. "We didn't, at first. But then the sheriff there recognized him from a wanted poster out of Arizona. Turns out Riker was wanted for murder in Tucson. Given the choice between hanging for that or testifying against Morgan for a reduced sentence, he made the sensible decision." "And the sheriff?" Pearl gestured toward Wilson, who was organizing the removal of Morgan's body. "He was firmly in Morgan's pocket when I left." "Amazing how a telegram from the territorial governor can change a man's allegiance," Fletcher commented, joining them on the porch. "Once we had Riker's confession, we wired the governor's office in Carson City. Turns out he's been looking for an excuse to investigate Morgan for years." Pearl shook her head in wonder. "So it's over, truly over. Morgan's dead," Owen confirmed. "His men won't fight without him, and with Riker's testimony implicating them in various crimes, most will probably flee the territory." He brushed a strand of hair from Pearl's face, his touch gentle. "The ranch is yours, free and clear." Sheriff Wilson approached, removing his hat respectfully. "Miss Vaughn, I owe you an apology. I should have investigated your father's murder more thoroughly 5 years ago." He looked genuinely remorseful. "Morgan had too much influence back then, but that's no excuse." "What happens now?" Pearl asked. "We'll round up any of Morgan's men who were directly implicated in crimes," the sheriff explained. "As for Morgan's property, well, without heirs, it will likely revert to the territory eventually. His business interests will be more complicated to untangle." After the sheriff and his men departed, taking Morgan's body and several prisoners with them, a strange quiet settled over the ranch. Wright and Donovan set about repairing damage from the gunfight, while Fletcher went to retrieve the horses that had scattered during the fighting. Pearl found herself sitting on the front porch steps, suddenly exhausted as the tension of the past days drained away. Owen settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "Standing up to Morgan, fighting for your home. Your father would be proud." Pearl leaned against him slightly, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Morgan told me things about you," she said after a moment. "That you killed one of his men in a saloon fight, that my father lied to save you from hanging." Owen was silent for so long that Pearl thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed. "It wasn't a saloon fight. One of Morgan's men, Garrett, had taken liberties with a young woman who worked in the laundry. I confronted him, told him to leave her be. He drew on me." Owen's voice was flat, emotionless. "I was faster." "Self-defense," Pearl said. "Yes, but Morgan had the town in his pocket. Would have been my word against his about what happened. Your father witnessed it, stepped forward when no one else would." Owen turned to look at her, his blue eyes troubled. "Morgan wasn't entirely wrong, Pearl. I have killed men, not always in circumstances as clear-cut as with Garrett." Pearl met his gaze steadily. We all have darkness in our past, Owen. What matters is the light we choose to walk toward. She took his hand, twining her fingers with his. And I choose to walk with you if you'll have me. Owen's expression softened, hope warring with disbelief. Pearl, you deserve better than a man like me. I deserve a man who sees me, truly sees me, Pearl replied. Not my scars or my limp, but me. You're that man, Owen Ingram. Owen lifted their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. I don't have much to offer you, he said honestly. No land, no fortune, just my hands and my heart. That's all I want, Pearl assured him. We can build the rest together. Owen smiled then, the last of his reserve melting away. He leaned forward, capturing her lips in a kiss that spoke of promise and possibility. Pearl responded eagerly, wrapping her arms around his neck and drawing him closer. When they finally parted, Owen rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Pearl Vaughn, he said simply. Have since the moment I saw you stand up to Morgan that first day, refusing to be cowed despite everything. And I love you, Pearl whispered back, for seeing strength in me when others saw only weakness, for being gentle with my heart even as you taught it to be brave again. Owen brushed his thumb across her scarred cheek. They said you'd never heal, he murmured, but they were wrong. They were, Pearl agreed, leaning into his touch. Because healing isn't about erasing the past, it's about building a future that honors it without being trapped by it. I'll be gentle every step of that journey, Owen promised, for as long as you'll have me. Forever then, Pearl replied with a smile. And in that moment, beneath the vast Nevada sky, with the ranch spreading out around them, a place once marked by tragedy now reclaimed for hope, Pearl knew that true healing had begun for both of them. 3 years later, Pearl stood on that same porch, watching as Owen led their year-old son Thomas on a gentle pony around the corral. The boy squealed with delight, his small hands gripping the saddle horn while his father kept a secure arm around him. Not too fast, Pearl called, though she knew Owen would sooner cut off his own arm than risk their son's safety. He's a natural, just like his mama, Owen called back, grinning as the toddler bounced excitedly on the pony's back. Pearl smiled, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach where their second child grew. The ranch had flourished under their care, expanding to include parts of what had once been Morgan's land, purchased legitimately at auction. Fletcher had stayed on as foreman, while Wright had taken over the small school in Tonopah Junction, finding his true calling as a teacher. Donovan had used his savings to buy a small spread neighboring theirs, and the two ranches often shared resources and hands. As for Pearl and Owen, they had married in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Sheriff Wilson officiating and half the town in attendance. The journey hadn't always been easy. They both carried scars, visible and invisible, that sometimes ached in the night. But they had kept their promise to each other to be gentle with one another's wounds, to face each challenge together, to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. Owen lifted Thomas from the pony and carried him to where Pearl waited, the boy's chubby arms outstretched eagerly for his mother. Pearl took him, balancing him on her hip with practiced ease. He's getting heavier every day, she observed, kissing her son's rosy cheek. Strong like his mother, Owen replied, slipping an arm around Pearl's waist and drawing her against his side. Pearl leaned into his embrace, content in a way she once thought impossible. Her legs still ached sometimes, especially when rain was coming. The scar on her face had faded to a silver line but would never disappear entirely. And yet, she no longer thought of herself as broken or damaged. She was whole, different from the girl she had been before the attack, but whole nonetheless. Stronger in the broken places, as Owen liked to say. "What are you thinking about?" Owen asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Pearl smiled up at him. About healing. About how sometimes the things that seem to break us beyond repair are actually just the beginning of becoming who we're meant to be. Owen's eyes, still that piercing blue that had first caught her attention 3 years ago, softened with understanding. "And who are you meant to be, Pearl Ingram?" She gestured toward the thriving ranch around them, the home they had rebuilt together, the family they had created. "This. All of this." She placed her hand over his heart. "Yours." Owen covered her hand with his own, his wedding band gleaming in the afternoon sun. "I told you I'd be gentle every step of the way," he said softly. "But you've been the one teaching me about gentleness, Pearl, about forgiveness, about second chances." "We taught each other," Pearl corrected, reaching up to trace the scar on his chin. "And we'll keep teaching each other for all the days to come." As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the Nevada landscape in shades of gold and amber, Owen wrapped his arms around his wife and son, holding them close as if they were the most precious treasures in the world, which, to him, they were. Not because they were perfect or unmarked by life's cruelties, but because they were real and true and his. Together, they had proven that healing was possible, even from wounds that seemed beyond repair. That with enough love, enough patience, enough gentle care, broken things could become beautiful again. Different, yes, but beautiful all the same.